Conscience protection. Lawmakers consider a bill to protect healthcare workers who won't perform abortions. Final farewell. Friends and family honor the Dallas officers killed in an ambush. Community policing. President Obama discusses improving race relations. And cyber war. How America is expanding its fight against ISIS. Those stories and more on EWTN News Nightly for Wednesday, July 13th, 2016. Good evening from Washington. Thank you for joining us. I'm Brian Patrick. The U.S. House votes on a bill protecting the conscience rights of healthcare workers who oppose abortion. Jason Calvi is at the Capitol tonight covering that vote. Jason?
Brian, the bill is called the Conscience Protection Act. Democrats called it obnoxious and an attack on women's health. Republicans talked about the doctors and nurses this bill would protect. A warning from the president-elect of the Catholic Medical Association.
The threat exists now that the government could potentially coerce us to perform abortions.
To stop that, Tennessee Representative Diane Black, a former nurse, is sponsoring the bill to protect healthcare workers. She points to a New York nurse forced to take part in an abortion.
We should also, as a healthcare worker, have that right to choose. When we have something that violates our conscience, as an abortion does, we should, as a worker, have the right to say, I choose not to participate.
Her fellow Republicans back the bill.
If we lose conscience in the area of something so profound as taking the life of an innocent child, then what remains? The whole notion of religious freedom, the whole notion of freedom is gone.
The Speaker of the House first announced today's vote on EWTN in an interview with Raymond Arroyo.
This is something that I feel very passionate about. This is something that I'm really worried about.
Ryan praised the bill last night.
I would like to think we could at least get consensus in this country that taxpayers shouldn't be funding abortions.
Absolutely.
That the government shouldn't be forcing people to conduct procedures, especially healthcare workers, against their own conscience.
But Democrats fiercely opposed the proposal today.
This is a hypocritical bill that would make it even harder for women to obtain the reproductive health care they need.
Dr. Boursicote says it comes down to the doctor-patient relationship.
Our job is to maintain the trust of our patients, to know that we will preserve life. We will fight to preserve life and good health.
The U.S. bishops, the Knights of Columbus, and the Southern Baptists are all supporting the Conscience Protection Act. Speaker Ryan says today's vote is in response to California. That state is mandating that all insurance plans cover abortion. Democrats say since the president would veto it, Republicans tonight are playing politics.
Thank you. Jason Calvi on Capitol Hill. Republican Representative John Fleming is a medical doctor from Louisiana. And Congressman, you've worked hard on this bill with others. Why is this issue so important to you?
Well, as you know, Brian, I'm a physician, a family doctor. I delivered over 300 babies. I participated with the birth, which is a godly, magical, mysterious process, even to me as a physician, many, many times, and enjoyed it every single time. I was there for the birth of my 4 children. And so it is certainly a high level of priority for me that we preserve preborn life. And so that's the reason why I'm fighting so hard for the Conscience Protections Act.
Now, you've had support from Catholic bishops on this. Have they worked with you closely in the wording?
Yes, they have. This goes back to the Weldon Amendment, which has been a year-to-year appropriations amendment going back over the last 12 years. In which there is in-law protection against being forced to in some way assist with abortion, but it's the responsibility of Health and Human Services to enforce that. Our worry is that they're not willing to enforce it. In fact, we just had a decision on a case in California where they do refuse to enforce it. So what my bill does is give a private right of action so people who are victimized can actually go to court. Whether you're a doctor or a nurse or any other kind of healthcare worker who's been forced to participate in an abortion in some way, or whether you're purchasing health insurance, as in the case of California, where every single plan that you purchase has an abortion rider on it that requires you to pay for elective abortions for others. And the Catholic bishops have worked very close with us. Paul Ryan, who is also a Catholic, a Christian, has worked very close with our staff as well. And we have what I think is the best possible language for this bill.
Republican Representative John Fleming, we appreciate your insight into the Conscience Protection Act.
Yes, thank you.
And other stories our EWTN News Nightly team is covering in today's world. Thousands gather today to honor 3 of the 5 police officers who died in Thursday's Dallas sniper attack. One of the officers, Brent Thompson's daughter, spoke at his funeral today.
And tonight we say our final goodbye, Daddy. We love you. Be safe.
A massive Christian burial was celebrated at Mary Immaculate Parish north of Dallas for Police Sergeant Michael Smith. The former Army Ranger is remembered for his upbeat attitude and compassionate approach to others. Senior Corporal Lauren Ahrens is the 3rd officer memorialized today. Services for the other 2 victims are scheduled for Friday and Saturday. President Obama opens the White House today to a diverse group of people addressing what some perceive as police bias. White House correspondent Lauren Ashburn can tell us more tonight. Lauren?
Brian, the president cleared his calendar this afternoon to meet with civil rights activists, police officers, and community activists from across the country. It was a wide net. Joining Attorney General Loretta Lynch and other White House officials in this private meeting were Black Lives Matter's Mika Grimm from Minnesota and the chief of police from St. Paul. Elected officials there, the NAACP, Reverend Al Sharpton, the police chief from Pittsburgh. Only one faith-based person attended. Dallas Baptist pastor Frederick Haynes, longtime Obama supporter. The goal of the private meeting is to have a discussion about the greater transparency between police and the community, to repair and build relationships after the death of 5 officers in Dallas. Also under discussion, increasing training requirements, making them more reality-based. That includes de-escalation scenarios. In the press briefing room, Press Secretary Josh Earnest acknowledged that change requires a collaborative effort with an open heart.
I think the first thing that the president will acknowledge is that there's no cookie-cutter solution that can be applied. Every community is different, and every community has their own unique dynamics. Every community has their own traditions. Every community has their own history. So that is why it is incumbent on governors and mayors and community leaders and leaders in law enforcement to focus on these kinds of solutions.
Yesterday, the president addressed many people at an interfaith ceremony, and today I asked the press secretary why the president included messages about gun control. He replied that he didn't see police in the room, disagreeing. Brian, back to you.
Thank you, Lauren Ashburn at the White House. Donald Trump tells his staff that he will announce his vice presidential pick on Friday. Trump and his team met this morning with Indiana Governor Mike Pence at the governor's residence in Indianapolis. He met privately Tuesday with New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. Both are on his short list, along with former House Speaker Newt Gingrich.
Thank you very much.
Pence campaigned with Trump near Indy last night.
I think he is going to be a great president. I think he is someone who has connected with everyday Americans like no one since Ronald Reagan.
Pence must decide by Friday if he will run for re-election as governor. State law will not allow him to run for 2 political offices at once. Donald Trump calls for Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to step down. She has stated publicly she feels Trump is unfit to be president. Trump tweeted today about the 83-year-old justice, "Her mind is shot, resign." Hillary Clinton calls Trump dangerous. She just spoke at a campaign stop in Springfield, Illinois.
His campaign is as divisive as any we have seen in our lifetimes. It is built on stoking mistrust and pitting American against American.
Clinton admits she also needs to do a better job controlling her words and actions. A Quinnipiac University poll shows Trump and Clinton are in a virtual tie in several swing states. Trump is up 42 to 39% in Florida. The candidates are tied at 41% each in Ohio, and Trump leads 43 to 41% in Pennsylvania. All of those are within the margin of error of that poll. Steel barricades will go up throughout downtown Cleveland ahead of next week's Republican National Convention. The city's traditional trash cans are being replaced by metal stands and clear trash bags as a security measure. An estimated 50,000 people will visit Cleveland during the convention, runs July 18th through the 21st. The State Department defends its online strategy amid accusations the U.S. is losing the information war to terrorists. Wyatt Goolsbee reports tonight from Capitol Hill.
Brian, we're hearing two different narratives here in Washington today. The State Department says that pro-terrorist content has been eradicated online within the last year, but many Republican lawmakers say the web is still awash with terrorist propaganda and not enough is being done.
It apparently doesn't take that much breach into the society in order to be able to find those disaffected people or those who can be easily radicalized.
Republican Congressman Ed Royce agrees the U.S. is mounting an effective online counteroffensive to ISIS, but he says there's still a long way to go. On Capitol Hill today, Royce and his fellow Republicans grilled a State Department official who pushed back.
I think this narrative that we are losing the information war with ISIL is wrong. In fact, mainstream Muslims are winning the information war with ISIL, and that is why we've seen that great boost of content.
Stengel defends President Obama's strategy to fight terrorism online, which is to empower individuals and groups around the world. He also says the State Department is working directly with companies like Facebook and Twitter.
Twitter itself said recently they've taken down more than 125,000 handles. They are all out there taking content off their platform.
But retired General Michael Flynn says there is much more the government and social networks can do to win the information war.
I got that they give money to this thing or that thing, but there's when we're communicating to over 1 billion people in some of these forums, Facebook and Twitter particularly, why don't they turn and create a positive message?
General Flynn urges the State Department to use the term radical Islam.
If they see this as anything but a real sick cancer that is violating large parts of the world, then we have a different situation on our hands.
Several House Democrats say one way they can help the State Department combat the ISIS ideology is through funding. More than $20 million in federal funding has been allotted to combat the ISIS online messaging specifically, but Stengel today admitted they could use more money on this issue. Brian?
Thanks. Wyatt Goolsbee on Capitol Hill. Arkansas says it has a new supply of a drug used for lethal injections that potentially clears the way for the state to resume executions after a decade-long hiatus. However, executions will remain on hold while the state Supreme Court weighs a request from 8 condemned inmates. They're challenging a ruling that allows the state to keep information about lethal injection drugs confidential. The Catechism of the Catholic Church leaves room for the death penalty, stating the traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude recourse to the death penalty if this is the only possible way of effectively defending human lives against an unjust aggressor. However, Pope Francis advocates for abolishing the death penalty worldwide. In a recent message to the Congress against the death penalty, the Holy Father wrote, "Nowadays, the death penalty is unacceptable. It is an offense to the inviolability of life and to the dignity of the human person." Coming up, Mothers Bond, seeking support for babies affected by Zika. And a big change in British politics as the Prime Minister resigns. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday evening. I'm Brian Patrick. We are learning more about the spread of the Zika virus in the U.S. The director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention testified today at a Senate hearing. Tom Frieden says no one has contracted Zika from mosquitoes in the continental U.S., but more than 1,000 Americans have become infected after traveling to other countries, including several hundred pregnant women. Frieden warns pregnant mothers to avoid traveling to places where Zika is spreading and do everything you can to avoid mosquito bites if you do go. And some new moms in Brazil take the brunt of the Zika virus while trying to care for their baby's health. They say they feel shunned by society. Every day, Maria Luisa plays her little princess a song of God's love for his children, and every day she cries.
I get sad because of everything that has happened. I'm not sad because of her. She makes me happy. She's wonderful.
Maria Luisa's husband left her a month after baby Thela Nayara was born with microcephaly. One relative even asked why she didn't abort the baby. Thela Nayara's older sister, too young to really understand, sometimes calls her crazy.
I say, your sister's not mad. She's a normal child like you.
Largely abandoned, Maria Luisa says her neighbor is now like a second parent to the girls. Support groups like this bring mothers together. In the epicenter of Brazil's Zika outbreak, the mothers of the so-called Zika babies lean on each other.
When I had my child and knew she had microcephaly, I was like every other mother. I thought I was the only one going through this.
Rosie Claudia's daughter, Carla, just turned 9 months old. Most of her days are spent going from one appointment to another. The sheer commitment of raising a child with microcephaly bonds these mothers into an extended family. Rosie Claudia says she feels her isolation most in public under the piercing stares of strangers.
People ask, she was born with that disease. They keep looking, whispering, look, the girl with the little head.
She says she's constantly making the case that her baby isn't diseased, but special. Most have experienced the same stigma. They hope and pray that society evolves to accept their children and not reject them. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention says Zika is mostly spread by mosquitoes, but it can also be spread through sexual contact. Most cases are mild. Right now, there is no medicine or vaccine to prevent the Zika virus. From Brexit to exit, British Prime Minister David Cameron receives a standing ovation today on his last day in Parliament. Members of the House of Commons thanked him for his 6 years of service as Conservative leader. Cameron resigned after the majority of British voters opted to leave the European Union. Today he poked fun at MP Jeremy Corbyn and his Labour Party's leadership turmoil.
We both have been having these leadership elections. We got on with it. We've had resignation, nomination, competition and coronation. They haven't even decided what the rules are yet. If they ever got into power, it'd take them about a year to work out who would sit where.
The new Prime Minister, Theresa May, met with Queen Elizabeth II today and assumed leadership. She says she plans to lead in the spirit of unity, building a country that works for everyone. Japan's public television reports Emperor Akihito intends to retire, relinquishing his title in the next few years. The 82-year-old Akihito has admitted to making small mistakes at recent ceremonies due to his age. The Imperial Household Agency had suggested reducing his duties, giving more responsibility to Crown Prince Naruhito. The last succession from a living emperor in Japan was about 200 years ago. Congress considers a bill prohibiting federal government discrimination against people and institutions expressing the belief that marriage is between one man and one woman. The Heritage Foundation states the First Amendment Defense Act would prohibit bureaucrats from retaliating against those who refuse to change their deeply held convictions of the truth about marriage. The conservative think tank calls it good policy. From Heritage, Roger Severino is with us tonight. People often accused of discriminating when they stand up for marriage. Aren't they, in a sense, being discriminated under this administration?
Indeed, and at the hearing yesterday, the testimony of Chief Kelvin Cochran stole the show. Chief Cochran was the Atlanta fire chief, an African-American who suffered tremendous discrimination because of his race. He worked his way to the top and was fired, not because of anything he did, but because he wrote a book defending the biblical understanding of sexuality on his own time. He was fired for that. There was no accusations of discrimination on his part. It was all about his views. He testified powerfully about his story. And even Barney Frank, the former member of Congress who opposed the First Amendment Defense Act, was forced to say that, yes, people like Chief Kelvin Cochran deserve to be protected, which essentially means a law like the First Amendment Defense Act is good policy and should be passed.
So what is at stake here specifically for Catholic schools, for churches, for charities connected with the church?
It's about the role of religion in the public square. Can they get an equal seat at the table without being discriminated against because of their views? So we had, for example, the adoption agencies in D.C., in Massachusetts, and elsewhere being banned, stripped of their licenses because they would not place couples, children in same-sex households because they thought it was contrary to their beliefs. We need more, not less, diversity when it comes to social services. The Catholic Charities in placing adopted children were the best at placing the hardest to place kids, and now they're being excluded because of their beliefs, and that's just wrong.
Why would we need legislation to protect us from, we are guaranteed these rights under the First Amendment. Why do we need legislation to carry that through?
Well, every generation has to stand up for our rights. The rights that are written in the Constitution need to be put in effect. Unfortunately, we have activist liberal judges and justices on the Supreme Court that don't respect the First Amendment. We saw that an activist judge in Mississippi struck down a law that was similar to the First Amendment Defense Act at the state level. So we need legislators to pass these laws at the federal level to protect federal rights, the rights of federal workers, the rights of agencies, of social service agencies and their licenses, the right of institutions not to lose their tax-exempt status because of their beliefs. So we need these laws to reinforce the rights and the promise of the First Amendment.
That is a key element of this issue, that losing that tax-exempt status. Roger Severino from the Heritage Foundation, thanks so much for being with us.
You're welcome.
Up next, reviewing the nuclear deal with Iran, what's working and what's not. And Sky High Adventure, a Russian Orthodox priest embarks on a record-setting trip around the world. We're grateful you can join us tonight for EWTN News Nightly. I'm Brian Patrick, and the Vatican sets November 5th as the day of beatification of 38 Albanian martyrs killed by the former communist regime. In April, Pope Francis officially recognized as martyrs the Catholic clergymen who died in prison or were murdered. Francis holds up Albania with the majority of Muslims and also with Orthodox and Catholic communities as a model for interfaith harmony. Well, 1 year ago, the U.S., 6 other world powers, and Iran reached a nuclear deal after almost 2 years of negotiations. The agreement called for caps on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions.
ما کاملا آمادگی داریم از لحاظ توانمندی هسته‌ای ما در یک شرایطی هستیم که
Iran's president says today the Islamic Republic is completely ready and able to restore its nuclear power, or program rather, quickly if other parties violate the deal. The agreement is fragile on its 1-year anniversary. Upcoming elections in the U.S. and Iran could yield new leaders determined to derail the pact, but for now, it's holding. Blaise Mishtal, director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's National Security Program, is with us. Is that a threat from Iran's president, and what is Iran doing to keep up its end of the bargain?
Well, both are true. On the one hand, Iran has done a lot, maybe more than critics expected. It has dramatically slashed the number of centrifuges it has, the amount of enriched uranium it has, and is really abiding by the majority, at least, of the restrictions that have been imposed on it by the deal. At the same time, it's always looking for an advantage. It's always rattling its saber. It's always trying to get more out of the deal. It's always looking for ways to maybe cheat or squeeze a little more out. So on the one hand, we should be happy that they are much further away from a nuclear weapon than they were a year ago before the deal, but we still need to keep our eye on them.
There was a lot of criticism of this deal originally. Has that changed over this year?
It hasn't, because a lot of the criticism, there was criticism of the deal itself, but a lot of the criticism was what happens outside of the deal and what happens after the deal. So one of the criticisms was this deal lapses in 10 to 15 years. What happens then? Is Iran allowed to have a nuke? And the other is Iran does a lot of bad stuff outside of its nuclear program. It supports terrorism. It's funding the wars in Syria and Iraq. What are we going to do about that? And we haven't seen a lot of progress in that area, which leads to even more criticism.
So essentially, if anything, we're buying time here in terms of the nuclear arrangement. What happens then when Iran has the freedom to go right ahead and develop more nuclear weapons?
That's exactly right. We're kicking the centrifuge down the road. There's a hope that was expressed by President Obama that maybe in 10 years, Iran will be a different country. Maybe it will become a democratic country. Maybe the leadership will change. But hope is not a strategy. And one of the things that critics have been asking for is, what is our plan? What do we do about Iran's support for terrorism? What do we do about its ballistic missile program? What do we do to try to limit the deal? And the best answer that we've heard so far is, if we keep pressuring them, maybe we can renew this deal. Maybe we can keep it going beyond its lifespan. But we haven't seen anything to convince us that that's going to happen yet.
Is the world safer or more at risk because of this deal, in your opinion?
It is safer today than it was a year ago, but it sets up the possibility of becoming much more dangerous a decade down the road.
From the Bipartisan Policy Center, Blaise Mishtal, thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Brian.
And the Holy Father names another American to an important position within the Church. Kim Daniels, advisor to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, will serve on the Vatican's Secretariat for Communication. Pope Francis created that body last year to manage and overhaul the Vatican's media outlets. St. Louis native Greg Burke was just named the Vatican's new press secretary. A 64-year-old Russian Orthodox priest is attempting to fly around the world in a hot air balloon in record time. Fyodor Konyakov lifted off in Western Australia Tuesday, given a warm send-off by his wife and children who watched him depart at sunrise. Konyakov hopes to beat the 13.5 days record time set by the late Steve Fossett. For the EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Brian Patrick. Good night. God bless you.